Welcome back, my friends, to Faces of History, the show where we wipe the ivy dust off the statues, break open the old Latin books, and get nose to nose with the people you thought you knew. I'm your host, the Duke of New York, and tonight we're heading back almost 400 years to a young, fragile colony clinging to the edge of the New World. Puritan hats, timber houses, the chill of uncertainty drifting in off the Atlantic, and in the middle of it all, a thin, scholarly man named John Harvard. Yes, that Harvard. The man whose name crowns America's oldest college, whose statue every freshman rubs for luck, whose legend stands taller than the truth that built it. But who was John Harvard, really? Where did he come from? Why did he matter? And what does it say about America that one of its greatest universities was launched not by kings or captains, but by a sickly preacher with a library and a dying wish? So pour yourself a cup of something warm, wrap your cloak tight, and lean in. Let's meet the man behind the name, John Harvard. To understand John Harvard, you have to begin not in the New World, but in the cramped, soot-blackened streets of early 17th century England. A land shadowed by plague, flickering with the firelight of religious turmoil and bracing itself for storms of change. John Harvard was born in 1607 in Southwark, a rough, bustling suburb of London perched on the south bank of the River Thames. If you'd walked through Southwark then, you'd have smelled the sour reek of the alehouses, heard the rowdy shouts spilling out of the theaters. Yes, those theaters, where Shakespeare's words still floated through the timber rafters of the globe. And you'd have felt the daily press of a city that never quite washed itself clean. Young John's father, Robert Harvard, was a butcher and tavern keeper, professions that planted the family firmly in the working middle class, neither noble nor destitute. His mother, Catherine Rogers, was known for her piety, a woman who clung fiercely to her faith in a country that was tearing itself apart over how to worship the same God. Southwark was no place for the faint-hearted. Fires swept through its crooked streets. Plague carts rattled past the tavern doors. When John was just a boy, the Great Plague of London returned, wiping out entire neighborhoods. By the time he was 15, the plague had swallowed up nearly all of his family, father, siblings, gone. Only John and his mother remained, two survivors in a city that seemed to test the faithful at every turn. But where some might see ruin, Catherine Harvard saw opportunity, or perhaps necessity. She married again, this time to a prosperous grocer named Richard Yearwood, who helped stabilize the family's fortunes just enough to send John to school. And here, under the flickering candlelight of the local grammar school, the sickly butcher's son learned to read his Latin and Greek, to bend his back over dusty volumes of Scripture and Cicero. In 1627, John Harvard walked beneath the ancient echoing spires of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, a haven for Puritans who dreamed of cleansing the Church of England of its Catholic remnants. Cambridge was more than a university then. It was a furnace of dissent, where young men sharpened their minds and their faith in equal measure. There, John read theology, logic, rhetoric, all the tools a preacher needed to build or demolish belief, brick by brick. And yet, despite the new life of books and prayer, England's shadow stretched long. The country was tearing itself apart in ways that would soon overflow into civil war. For the Puritans, and for John Harvard, England was increasingly a land of closed doors and locked pulpits. The monarchy saw dissenters as threats. The established church jealously guarded its rituals and hierarchy. And so, like many before and after him, John looked across the cold, heaving Atlantic to a place whispered about in the taverns and pulpits, New England. It's easy now to imagine Harvard as a figurehead, a marble statue in a courtyard tourists swarm for photos. But in these early days, he was just another young man caught between a plague-ravaged past and an uncertain promise. He carried with him a battered body, a sharp mind, and a seed of hope planted deep by loss. A hope that, in a new world, a man's faith in books might build something better than the city that buried his family. This is the shadow England cast, a shadow that stretched all the way across the ocean, from the taverns of Southwark to a clearing by the Charles River where a dying preacher's books and a few coins would plant the seed of America's oldest college. When John Harvard crossed the threshold of Emmanuel College, Cambridge, he stepped into more than just stone halls and cloistered courtyards. He entered an intellectual battleground. The air inside Emmanuel was thick with the sharp scent of ink and argument. Here, young men who would one day sail across oceans or challenge kings sat hunched over borrowed volumes, scribbling notes by candlelight, debating predestination and the corruptions of bishops. Founded in 1584 by Sir Walter Mildmay, Emmanuel was a haven for Puritans. It wasn't just a college. It was an incubator for reformers. Its students believed that the Church of England, the grand compromise between Catholic ritual and Protestant reform, needed more cleansing. They dreamed of stripping the altars bare, tearing down elaborate vestments, and putting the raw word of Scripture back into the hands of common people. In this world, John Harvard was not an anomaly, but he was remarkable. He was quiet, bookish, and doggedly serious, no small feat at a time when plague and war made youth painfully aware of mortality. Cambridge records show he earned his B.A. in 1632 and his M.A. in 1635. Steady progress for a young man whose lungs were probably already weakening from the consumption that would eventually kill him. But it wasn't just theology that shaped him. It was the conviction that knowledge itself was sacred. Harvard's mind roamed far beyond the pulpit. He inhaled the works of the Church Fathers, but also the classics, Virgil, Aristotle, Cicero, and the legal commentaries that stitched society together. For Puritan students like Harvard, learning wasn't an ornament of the elite. It was a weapon. A well-trained mind could pierce heresy, challenge tyrants, and carve out a new world in the wilderness. When John took his vows as a dissenting clergyman, he did so in a country that increasingly saw men like him as troublemakers. The Crown under Charles I cracked down on radical preachers and congregations. Puritan ministers were silenced, censored, even dragged before ecclesiastical courts for daring to question the king's bishops. Many faced ruin or exile. For Harvard, this tension, the dream of preaching freely and the iron fist of royal decree, lit the fuse for his journey west. Back home in Southwark, tragedy struck again. In 1635, the plague returned, a grim reminder that death always lingered close in those tight London streets. Catherine Harvard, the pious mother who had shielded John from utter ruin after his father died, succumbed. She left him an inheritance, modest but meaningful, which, combined with the books he had gathered, would soon take on a life of its own. In November 1637, newly married to a minister's daughter named Anne Sadler, John Harvard boarded a ship for New England. The Atlantic crossing in the 17th century was no pleasure cruise. It was a heaving, fetid ordeal. 6 to 8 weeks of storms, spoiled provisions, seasickness, and the ever-present threat of shipwreck. But for Harvard, the ocean offered more than danger. It offered escape. On the other side lay a frontier where dissenters could breathe freely, where churches could be built without bishops, where a man's library could be the seed of a new Jerusalem. He landed in Charlestown, Massachusetts, a settlement little more than timber huts and cold mud in winter. And yet, compared to the soot and plague carts of Southwark, it must have felt like air newly minted by God. There, John Harvard found not comfort, but calling. He preached to a fledgling congregation. He tended to the sick, comforted the fearful, and continued to gather his precious books, volumes that were, for many in the colony, the only copies of their kind this side of the Atlantic. But the brutal Atlantic winds had not washed away Harvard's frailty. His body, already weakened by disease, began to fail under the New England chill and the relentless demands of frontier life. In 1638, less than a year after he arrived, John Harvard fell ill, likely tuberculosis, and died at just 31. He left behind no children, no published works, just a widow, a small collection of books, nearly 400 volumes, an astonishing treasure for the time, and half his estate bequeathed to a fledgling college in nearby Newtown that had opened its doors 2 years earlier. That dying wish, a preacher's library and a modest purse, became the cornerstone of what we now call Harvard University. A man who never taught a class there, who never built a dormitory, who never delivered a commencement address, and yet whose name became synonymous with American higher learning. Harvard was not a titan in life, not a king, a general, or a millionaire. He was a frail scholar and humble preacher, shaped by plague and Puritan zeal, driven by the stubborn conviction that knowledge and faith should survive even when flesh fails. And so, in that wind-battered village by the Charles River, The sickly butcher's son became something more, not through conquest or crown, but through a quiet gift of pages and pounds. The Atlantic Ocean in the 17th century was more than a stretch of salt and storms. It was a threshold between worlds. For John Harvard, it was a final, desperate leap away from the rot and ruin of England's narrow alleys toward a promise that seemed as fragile as the ships that carried him. We can only imagine what must have passed through his mind as the sails of the John of London, or Defence, the very ships that ferried so many Puritans west, vanished from the sight of England's grey coastline. He left behind the clamor of London's taverns, the stench of plague carts rumbling down muddy lanes, the echo of sermons given in secret corners. Ahead lay only fog, salt spray, and the wind's cold promise of something better. The voyage itself was an ordeal that broke lesser men. Below deck, the cramped quarters were damp and reeking. Passengers slept beside barrels of salted beef and worm-riddled biscuits, the stale air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. Seasickness was a given, but far worse were the storms that could snap masts like twigs or scatter families to watery graves. More than one Puritan dream found its end in the black depths of the Atlantic, stitched into the cold silence of the ocean floor. But John Harvard made it. By some mixture of providence, stubbornness, and sheer luck, he stepped ashore in New England, Charlestown, to be exact, in 1637. What he found was not a land flowing with milk and honey, but a settlement barely clinging to existence. Timber houses perched along the frost-hardened earth, smoke drifted from crude stone chimneys, fields lay raw and stony, wolves howled at the tree line. And yet, here, men like Harvard could stand in pulpits without a bishop's permission, could gather in homes to read scripture free of a king's spies, could build new churches out of nothing but conviction and logs. Imagine the contradictions. A frail scholar, lungs heavy with disease, stepping into a howling wilderness. The same books that once perched on a shelf in smoky Southwark now sat on a rough wooden table in a drafty New England cottage. Harvard's sermons drifted from the windows of the Charlestown Meeting House into the cold Atlantic wind, joining the hymns of a people carving their faith into untamed soil. Yet Harvard did not live to see the college that would bear his name grow tall. Just months after he arrived, illness overtook him. The records say he served as a teaching elder in Charlestown's tiny congregation, offering what he could to souls just as battered by the crossing as he was. But by September 1638, barely 31, John Harvard lay dying. Consumption, tuberculosis, stole his breath as surely as the Atlantic winds had carried him from England. In his final days, the young preacher put pen to parchment. He left half his modest estate, about 780 pounds, and his entire precious library, nearly 400 books, to the little school that had opened its doors in Newtown, later renamed Cambridge, Massachusetts. The college had begun just 2 years before, born out of the same Puritan vision that had ferried Harvard himself across the ocean, a conviction that a learned ministry was vital to the survival of this fragile experiment. In that bequest, Harvard's crossing took on new meaning. The Atlantic was not just a barrier, it was a conduit. Ideas, carried in battered volumes of Aristotle and Calvin, crossed the ocean just as surely as men did. Harvard's books were a bridge, from the smoky study halls of Emmanuel College to the timber halls of a brand new world. His library contained the seeds of philosophy, theology, law, knowledge that would outlive the plague that killed his family and the disease that stilled his lungs. Years later, the General Court of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, recognizing the weight of this gift, named the fledgling college Harvard. The name was not a celebration of wealth or conquest, but a quiet monument to the idea that knowledge is worth the voyage, worth the sacrifice, worth crossing oceans for. Every time a student steps through Harvard Yard today, they walk in the ghost steps of a thin, pale preacher who never lived to see a single class graduate. The Atlantic that once threatened to drown him became the moat around his legacy, a legacy that would go on to shape presidents, poets, revolutionaries, and philosophers. John Harvard's crossing was no grand triumph. There were no parades, no marble busts at the docks when he arrived. Just a sick man clutching his books and his faith, stepping off a wooden ship into the raw wind of a place that was not yet a country, but would one day claim him as one of its founders, not of armies or governments, but of minds. In the end, the voyage was not simply about a man crossing an ocean. It was about an idea crossing time, that a library, a preacher's stubborn dream, and a handful of coins could plant a seed that would grow beyond kings and colonies, beyond plagues and storms, all the way to us. Stand in Harvard Yard today, beneath the branches of ancient elms where tourists cluster like pilgrims at the foot of a certain statue, and you'll see how time has turned a thin, sickly preacher into a legend of granite and bronze. There he sits, John Harvard, founder, 1638. The inscription reads in letters so firm they seem to declare an unshakable truth. But scratch the surface of the bronze, and you'll find that the truth, like so much of history, is far messier and far more revealing. First, the statue itself is not even an accurate likeness. No portrait of John Harvard survives. When sculptor Daniel Chester French, the same man who would later carve Abraham Lincoln into solemn marble for the Lincoln Memorial, was commissioned in the 19th century to immortalize Harvard, he had nothing to go on but myth and imagination. So he used a Harvard student, Sherman Hoare, as the model for Harvard's face, a living stand-in for a man dead for over 2 centuries. Even the title founder is misleading. John Harvard did not found the college that bears his name. He did not draft its charter, design its curriculum, or oversee its first classes. That honor belongs to the colony's early ministers and magistrates who dreamed up the idea that an educated clergy was the backbone of their new Puritan experiment. Harvard, at most, was its first major benefactor. But history loves a simple story, and so we remember the college not as a collective creation, but as the legacy of one dying man's generosity. But myths have power precisely because they smooth out the edges that make history so jagged. Over time, the myth of John Harvard grew into a symbol bigger than the man himself, a stand-in for the idea that knowledge can transform even the most fragile beginnings. Each fall, hundreds of freshmen line up to rub the toe of that statue's left shoe for luck, a ritual that has polished the bronze to a gleaming gold. They pose for photos, dreaming of futures as lawyers, doctors, poets, presidents, their smiles oblivious to the fact that the tradition itself is built on misunderstandings. The so-called Statue of Three Lies, they call it now, because it tells 3 fibs in plain sight. John Harvard was not the founder, Harvard was not founded in 1638, but 1636, and the statue's face is pure fiction. And yet, maybe it's fitting that this monument stands half in truth and half in legend, because John Harvard's true gift was never his own life story. His gift was his books, the pages that crossed the ocean when he did, the words that outlasted the plague, the ideas that survived him by centuries. His short life, so fragile and ordinary by the standards of great men and kings, reminds us that the spark of learning often comes not from palaces, but from humble corners. A butcher's son, a preacher's dying wish, a battered trunk of volumes unloaded onto New England soil. Memory can be a treacherous thing. We polish the parts that shine, we bury the parts that don't. The real John Harvard was not a marble saint, but a sickly, determined scholar who stitched his faith and books together into a legacy that even he could not have imagined. Today, his name echoes far beyond the little meeting house where he preached his final sermons. It floats through lecture halls where Nobel laureates and budding poets argue and dream. It whispers across law libraries, science labs, and debating societies. Proof that sometimes the most enduring legacies are the ones that start quietly, far from the roar of battle or the glare of thrones. The myth of John Harvard sits in Harvard Yard, a bronze toe gleaming under countless hands. The memory of John Harvard lives in the minds he never met, the books he never read, the questions he never asked, but that are asked every day in classrooms built from the rough timber of his bequest. In the end, maybe the greatest truth is that a legacy is not a statue or a name carved in stone. It is an idea that travels across oceans, across centuries, finding new voices to carry it forward, even as the man himself fades into the ivy and dust of time. So if you ever stand in Harvard Yard, pause at that statue, the Statue of Three Lies, and remember the man behind the myth. Not a founder, not a saint, but a frail scholar with lungs full of sickness and a mind hungry for truth. A man who crossed an ocean with a library in his luggage and a dream that faith and knowledge could flourish in raw, uncharted soil. A man who reminds us that sometimes the smallest stories echo the loudest if we care enough to lean in and listen. So next time you see the Harvard crest on a sweatshirt or hear a president say, I went to Harvard, remember, none of it happens without a sickly young preacher who gave away his books so an idea could live longer than he did. Thank you for peeling back the layers with me tonight on Faces of History. I'm the Duke of New York. If you like this story, share it, subscribe, and leave us a review. And remember, behind every statue is a real human face. Look closer, read deeper, and never stop asking, whose shoulders are you standing on? Good night.